Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops, number 19 of Series 10. The question for today is free will a function of consciousness and identity rather than causality? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 4. We should begin by saying that the idea of free will has been a long-standing and difficult problem. John Searle, for example, described the lack of progress concerning free will as a scandal in philosophy. And this issue has been so intractable, we should suspect that we're looking at it the wrong way. So today, I hope to make some progress in this issue by employing the concept of consciousness. To illustrate this point, we can first see that free will correlates with reflective consciousness, and that reflective consciousness is a precondition of free will. Animals, for example, don't have free will. But I want to begin by making several qualifications about the idea of free will. Firstly, the idea of free will, like the soul, is ancient and has changed again in modern times. Its meaning has changed in different contexts of understanding and with many new perspectives. These include causal science, the unconscious, and neuroscience on one side of the debate, and causality, complexity, constant conjunctions, and consciousness on the other. Yes, consciousness is a new concept, first stated by John Locke only in 1681. So the first change is from a binary conception of cause and effect to complex causal fields and other interpretations. Secondly, the motivating personal identity has changed from an essence to self-creating choices. And thirdly, the soul has changed from an animating life force to that of reflective consciousness. The relevance of these changes to the idea of free will become clearer as we proceed. But we can say that theories of mind and motivation are crucial to understanding free will and its debate. For example, John Locke said that the question was not whether the will is free, but whether we have will. And for myself, I believe that the idea of free will is so misleading that I replace it with the idea of self-will. The notion of self-will also expresses the compatibilist theory that I want to conclude with. So all my preferences to free will must be understood in inverted commas. Secondly, interest in free will often derives from its function as a reason to find self-value or self-esteem. For example, Robert Nozick says that an absence of free will undercuts meaning in life. But I think that free will isn't an adequate means of finding self-value, self-esteem or meaning. I argue for other ways of finding self-value or self-esteem elsewhere. Thirdly, and similarly, interest in free will often derives from its ethical function in attributing blame or merit. And we might legitimately ask how there can be any moral action without presupposing free will. But in my view, moral blame or praise is an inadequate way of describing human action. And fourthly, my main concern is to use the idea of free will to show the significance of consciousness. That is, although I will argue for a compatibilist version of free will, I'm not primarily interested in the question of free will itself. And again, I think the notion of free will should be replaced with the idea of self-will. But the basic problem of free will is that we have two powerful yet contradictory insights. Firstly, we feel ourselves able to act, at least sometimes, freely. And secondly, the principle of universal causation, that every event has a sufficient cause, is indispensable. But the view that universal causation prevents something like free will is simplistic, because it ignores above noted different forms of causality like complex causal fields and quantum mechanics. It overlooks the possibility of replacing causality with reasons for action. And it also ignores the graduation of mind and the function of consciousness. But Simon Blackburn poses a challenge to these anti-deterministic views and to my own appeal to consciousness. That is, he asks us to explain how two situations can demand different ethical responses without referring to a difference in the situations themselves. Unquote. My response is that identical situations have to account for the identities of the agents, which can't be identical. That is, personal identity is a factor in making choices, and everyone's conception of themselves will be different. Also, different degrees of awareness will produce different responses in otherwise identical situations. And talking about identical situations in the way Blackburn does neglects consciousness and personal identity. Blackburn could answer that consciousness and identity have no bearing on the material outcome of such action. But the position that I want to argue below is that personal identity, consciousness, and degrees of awareness are crucial in the argument for free will. Bernard Williams connected personal identity to free will, but he never developed it. But I hope to show the relevance of personal identity in unexpected ways. And my position is compatibilist, as a form of free will, as self-will that is compatible with reasons for action. I want to present 4 or 5 arguments in support of this view. I say 4 or 5 because the arguments are related. But before embarking on those arguments, I want to discuss the populist work Determined by Robert Sapolsky. Sapolsky gives us the opportunity to examine a hardline determinist view based on neurology. But my doubts about Sapolsky begin when he said that he hasn't believed in free will since his adolescence, and that when we put all the relevant scientific results together, there's no room for free will. Sometimes there's a place for this kind of exclusive argument, but there's a danger of making assumptions. One of these assumptions is his admitted preference for a reductionism to neurology as the gold standard. Other assumptions that Sapolsky makes are that the relevant results are scientific and causally efficacious, that their relevancy is obvious, and that no other relevant factors have been omitted. Yet, as suggested, there could be a lot of other factors, and my paradigm example is that of consciousness. But Sapolsky doubles down, saying nothing like a homunculus can be shoehorned into the explanation. Yet there's no need to shoehorn anything, because we can ride a coach and horses through in the form of consciousness. The significance of consciousness, however, remains to be argued shortly. But Sapolsky has dismissed it without consideration by saying that the question of consciousness is ridiculous. And despite discussing preconscious decisions, delayed intent, and different forms of awareness, he dismisses consciousness by saying that I don't understand what consciousness is, I can't define it, and I can't understand philosophers writing about it. Unquote. This stance seems to be an instance of the neglect of consciousness that I have argued at length, as well as being another assumption. Yet his way out is that consciousness is an epiphenomenon on the back of neurological activity. But it is counterintuitive that conscious beliefs or values can have no independent effect on action. Yet Sapolsky seeks to disprove that a neuron or brain whose generation of a behaviour is independent of the sum of its biological past. Unquote. And against my earlier definition, this is why defining free will is also such a pointless task for Sapolsky. It is because, like so many other neurologists, he is fixed and final explanations in terms of neurons or brains, in which he assumes unbroken causal sequences rather than new kinds of emergent relations for different kinds of phenomena, namely physical events and mental states. Yet he does claim to explain theories of free will, but these turn out to be common confusions about free will, such as change in a deterministic world, avoiding the resulting anarchy, and confusions between biological characteristics and self-motivation or intent, and about emergent complexity. But emergent complexity can also have valid applications, as I'll show later. Sapolsky also explains the influence of genetic, neurological, biological, historical and sociological factors. But this is part of his exclusive approach that assumes final explanations in terms of neurology. So he doesn't engage in classic arguments for and against free will. Some of the arguments he rejects are partial free will, situational free will, and free will in a subset of us. And despite these being crucial to some arguments, he rejects them by only calling them frothy. But against Sapolsky's assumptions, the 4 or 5 arguments promised earlier are as follows. 1. An argument from a phenomenology of consciousness. 2. An argument from a graduation of consciousness and correlation between reflective consciousness and free will. 3. An argument from self-identification with certain mental and neurological events. 4. A valid argument about the complexity of those neurological events. And lastly, alternatives to causal relations. The first phenomenological or existential argument is about our experience of free will. The usual existential argument is that we experience free will in our responsibility and anxiety. But another argument is that it's psychologically impossible to believe that our actions are determined. This is because this belief would be such an impediment as to prevent us from acting at all. More than that, even if our actions are determined, we still have choices. Determinism doesn't prevent choice, it claims to prevent what are called free choice. But believing or acting as if we don't have free will negates the choices that we have. Whatever the origins of choices, the idea that we are not choosing to do this or that is false. So determinism cannot mean that we act like robots as though our choices have no significance. Choices and believing we have choices have consequences. Not accepting this is a travesty of the issue. Moreover, we struggle to make choices, and that struggle affects the kind of choices that we make. Given this belief, metaphysical issues about free will become less relevant to the meaning of our choices. This is so because we cannot avoid believing that we are responsible for at least some of our actions, and this belief accounts for an existential-like concern over morals, meaning and purpose. So what is relevant to our existential lives is the phenomenal fact that we appear or seem to have free will. And this unshakable belief that we have free will must figure in the forces that shape our will. Therefore, the question about free will might be seen as phenomenological, not metaphysical. Yet there's another consequence of the psychological impossibility in believing that our actions are determined. That is, this realization forces us to try to make sense of this experience. And we must ask, what is the predicament of this agent, that is ourselves, in this situation? And the function of consciousness thereby comes to the fore, to be discussed shortly. But we must first review some basic arguments for determinism. The standard case for free will is made by both psychological determinism and physical determinism. Psychological determinism is significantly based on psychology rather than phenomenology. And psychology tends to understand the mind as the brain with closed inputs and outputs. We previously saw the difference between Dayton's phenomenal self and the psychological self, and I have briefly outlined such an argument for free will above. Yet psychological determinism presupposes physical determinism that we must look at first. That is, every physical event has a cause, and there are no uncaused events, including events in human minds. Otherwise, the world would be chaotic and scientific understanding would be impossible. As evidence of this view, Benjamin Libet found indications of neurological activity that preceded thought. Libet detected unconscious brain activity before any recognized intention to act. This was supposed to show that mind events were preceded by brain events. Following this method, Sam Harris also asked us to imagine a neurological device to detect the subtlest changes in brain function. This would indicate what we were going to do before we had awareness that we were going to do it. Their conclusion is that acts we previously considered free choices were driven by unseen prior events. But these demonstrations of supposedly neurological preconscious causes do not disprove free will. What they do prove is unconscious mental activity that is part of our decision-making processes. And we also cannot accept the presupposition of the Cartesian transparency of mind and a rationalization that rejects unconscious mental activity as not as my own or not representing my free decisions. For example, speech also appears mysteriously from the unconscious without impugning our freedom. That is, decisions can be products of unconscious thought in the form of previously digested conscious choices, and decisions can be products of pre-existing values that are pre-conscious and evade conscious awareness. My point is that pre-conscious mind or brain activity does not prove determinism. Moreover, the holistic character of thought might not be captured by particular neural events. Sapolsky also unexpectedly rejects the conclusiveness of Libet's experiments for similar reasons. Such is also expressed in such theories as Donald Davidson's anomalous monism and David Wiggins' notion of cognitive underdetermination. Yet determinists often say that even overtly conscious reasons for choosing hide unconscious motivations. But the question of degree and graduation comes in here as to what weight we give to these motivations. Our deliberated choice can be given greater weight as our own over discrete hidden motives. Yet psychological and physical determinism presupposes a particular concept of causality as noted earlier. But singular causes, for example, are anachronistic and need to be replaced by complex causal fields. As a basic example, did Jack fall off the ladder because he was too fat, inattentive, or for some other reason? My point is that causes are much more obscure than supposed. An argument for this is David Hume's notion of causality as an opaque process of constant conjunctions. That is, Hume argued that physical causes aren't discovered by necessity, but are determined by observation, and that many causes that we observe are assumed and even turn out to be mistaken. This shows that the concept of causation is much more obscure than we thought it was. Although some things can be known about causality, such as the error of supposing an uncaused cause, and that we simply can't apply causality indiscriminately to complex relations of mind and matter. And we should also note that there are random and uncaused events that exist in the quantum world. But causal anomalies or quantum events don't offer a special class of discrete events useful to free will. Free will requires a kind of cause that's both personal and independent from standard causal processes. I say much more about these kinds of relation in podcasts number 31 and 3 in this series 10. And at this junction, we need to make an important distinction between physical causes and reasons for action. That is, free will isn't just a matter of physical causation, but involves mental and cognitive relations. For example, Aristotle differentiated voluntary from involuntary actions and reason from causes. For instance, 2 plus 2 doesn't cause 4, but 2 plus 2 produces or necessitates 4 as an outcome. The conclusion is that reasons for action are different from causes of actions, and that people act on reasons, not causes. But this distinction between reasons and causes does not yet provide an argument for free will. This is because actions are motivated by reasons that have to come from somewhere, and it is the origin of these reasons that again might arguably give grounds for determinism. But as noted earlier, the weight, character, or origins of hidden reasons cannot be assumed. And as for their relation to neurology, Donald Davidson pondered that the only source of an idea is another idea. That is, actions must be motivated by reasons, yet they can be unconscious or holistic, or not even conceptual. If they are not, they either produce instinctive or insane acts which aren't the motivations of free will. The question is then, how can reasons for action be regarded as initiating free will? We need to step back for a moment and ask about the origins of reasons for action. And reasons for action should not always be defined in strictly rationalist terms. Yet neither uncaused quantum events or holistic thought release us from a wider circle of explanation. Reasons for action of some kind are still required. Actions without reasons are incoherent, not free. But reasons can include a wider circle of meaning, perception, and human consciousness. That is, facts like personal identity and knowing that I exist can be reasons for action. Yet we need to explain how they can be reasons for action. To show this, we need to return to the idea of graduation, degrees of awareness, and even consciousness. With this idea, we can see that animals, fetuses, and the comatose certainly don't have free will. That is, they can't deviate from instincts and impulses. But reflective human consciousness has a capacity for what we call free will. And it seems an oversight to think this reflective capacity doesn't have some kind of effect on motivation. That is, one's conception of oneself or personal identity must enter into one's reasons for action. And against Blackburn, personal identity can have material consequences on outcome, and the denial or obfuscation of consciousness also have similar denials of outcome. For example, Robert Sapolsky rejects both free will and the coherence of consciousness. Quoting him again, he says, "I don't understand what consciousness is." Conversely, consciousness and free will are central to the thinking of Sartre. But Sartre regarded consciousness as an ungraduated plenum with a kind of finality of existence. And he consequently thought that we are wholly and forever free or not free at all, unquote. But following the idea of graduation and degrees of consciousness, an ungraduated free will is implausible. And some thinkers like Merleau-Ponty, Julian Baggini, and myself believe in degrees of free will. Social science also reveals diminishing degrees of choice in the reasons why we do things. So we must ask, to what extent can our choices be considered to be made freely? More broadly, it is practically indisputable that reflective consciousness is a necessary condition of any free will. Moreover, if free will exists, it must exist in different degrees at different levels of consciousness. and different degrees of consciousness or awareness change the quality of a reason for action. Moreover, the existence of reflective consciousness itself could be argued to be a factor in reasons for action, and it can be further argued that such factors call for something like free will to explain them. Yet this is an argument about preconditions and not yet an argument for free will. This is my second argument based on consciousness and on degrees of consciousness. It is as follows. Firstly, reflective consciousness is essential to the possibility of free will. 2, there are different levels or degrees of consciousness in animal and human development. 3, higher levels of consciousness produce greater degrees of what we call free will. Therefore, something exists at different levels that we call free will. But we need to define what this is and redefine free will. We should first look at Sartre's attempt to employ consciousness as a basis for free will. He holds that man is condemned to be free, that is, to make his own choices and be responsible for them. So conscious human beings cannot escape choice, and we are therefore condemned to be free. Yet Sartre also holds that choice and consciousness are one and the same thing, that if we cannot escape choice, and even not to choose is a kind of choice. He says that I ought to know that if I do not choose, I'm still choosing. But I'm not sure. We might be indifferent or simply unaware of our choices. And we must remember that our choice is not the same as free choice. We also saw that Sartre thinks that we are either wholly and forever free or not free at all. But as we said, Merleau-Ponty, Baggini, social science and myself argue against a binary or an either-or view. And the graduation of mind and awareness argues for degrees of free will. So I don't believe that Sartre's account of consciousness and free will is acceptable. One way to show the significance of the relation between consciousness and free will is with the concept of possibility. That is, some events are brought into existence by consciousness that are the products of possibility. In a closed, causal and physical world, for example, there can be no conception of other possibilities. But consciousness conceives of an infinite number of possible ideas, and each of these possible ideas can become an influential factor in itself. And in this way, they break out of a closed system of cause and effect. Yet I think we need to look for something else about consciousness in addition to graduation and possibility. We need to look for something that is uniquely our own, but makes our reasons for actions our own. This is because if our reasons for actions are our own, they are free from external constraint. And the crucial property of consciousness that is unique and personal is our personal identity. So I need to say something about relations between personal identity and free will. And again, this is a connection that Bernard Williams made. Daniel Dennett is a compatibilist who finds his personal connection by saying that neurons are my neurons. But Dennett can't take this identity much further because he denigrates both consciousness and the self. For Dennett, neurons interact as a process that creates the user illusion of consciousness. But my third argument for free will is about our identification with our own thoughts and ideas. This identification with our own thoughts employs a crucial distinction between self and non-self. That is, we can identify with our thoughts and reasons for action. They are our own and we are free. But it is illusory to identify every thought as our own. We also have a huge capacity for misidentifying our motivations for reasons of bias and unconscious motives. For example, consciousness is constantly attending to its dispositions and can't be separated from them. This identification gives the false impression of ownership, choice and free will. Yet this is a syndrome that's usually used as an argument for determinism. But this is an error of misidentification that also provides an argument for free will as self-will. Identification with thoughts that precede choices cannot always be distinguished from one's own identity. We have some thoughts that we claim as our thoughts unless they are intrusive thoughts. And the question of free will presupposes a distinction between my reasons for action and alien reasons. But identification with preceding thought enables a claim that my reasons are aspects of myself. Therefore, these reasons are my reasons, and I have them, and when I have them, I have free will when I act on them. The possibility of not acting on reasons that I don't identify with also provides a basis for belief in free will. For example, coerced actions or actions not based on authentic beliefs when not acting on internalized values. But there's a question about the deepest origins of our thoughts not being our own and thereby undermining free will. Yet the indiscernibility of those origins can be employed as an argument for free will. That is, it becomes increasingly impossible to differentiate acts of the will from certain neurological and other causes. This is because at deeper levels of mind there is increasing degrees of complexity in their causal fields. We can thereby correctly identify those complex incipient causes or reasons as our own. This is because they are indistinguishable from our own thoughts and reasons, and if we identify those causes as our own, then we are free when we act on them. I'm saying that the origin, the kind of motivation, and seeing them as our own are crucial in the question of free will, and that I can claim free will if motivation is derived from a source that I can regard as my own will. I cannot claim free will if motivation is derived from an external source that compels me to act. And this distinction is harder to maintain as we look deeper into the origins of motivation. At increasingly deeper levels, the distinction between my impulses and alien impulses becomes less viable. And the origin of motivation as either self or non-self becomes increasingly less significant. Internalized thought and identification with impulses become valid motivations in free choice. The identification of certain thoughts with ourselves thereby provides a realistic claim of free will as self-will. It offers a solution to the contradiction between causal determinism and free will, and it also avoids the incoherence of a choice without a preceding mental event. This is a form of compatibilism or graduated compatibilism, yet it should also be described as self-will rather than free will. And the standard question used to determine free will of could I have acted otherwise becomes redundant. I could have acted differently, but according to another set of ideas. Yet those ideas would still be subject to the judgment of whether they are mine or not. If the ideas are not mine, I won't act on them. If they are mine, I will act on them. Either way, I have free will. Thereby the question, could I have acted otherwise, given another set of ideas, is redundant. It is like the centralist question, what would I have done if I was a different person? But doesn't just accepting motivations as my own simply give up the possibility of what we call real free will? No, it doesn't, for two reasons. One, we are still discriminating between what motivations we identify with and those we don't. Free will is acting according to my own interrelated ideas and beliefs. And two, yet the complex and graduated nature of our deepest motivations eventually nullifies that distinction. These are two valid ways of discriminating between motivations that support a form of free will. And as noted elsewhere, the thoughts in our heads don't all have the same status or origin. Some of them are: 1. Internalized thoughts or even unwelcome thoughts. 2. Having a thought is not identical to wanting to carry it out. And 3. There are differences between thoughts, intention, speech and action. One outcome is this compatibilist form of free will can be described as self-will. In the cases where 1. Primary mental events are validly interpreted as my own reasons for action. 2. Greater degrees of free will correlate with greater degrees of consciousness and choice. The view that we're totally determined is as incredible as the view that we are totally free. The idea of complexity of the earliest origins of our thoughts further undermines both the binary account and a strict distinction between alien thoughts and thoughts that I identify as my own. It has been argued, for example, that even the physical world is too complex to be absolutely determined, and the origins of human motivation is even more complex than the physical world. To clarify this process of ever-increasing complexity, integration and identification, we can describe it in two ways. 1. Reaching down from consciousness to the unconscious across a spectrum of mental states. 2. Reaching up from indiscernible first courses to reflectively conscious acts of will. The motivational process reaches down into a regress of ever more subtle, complex and holistic forms of interaction with thoughts and ideas. And at incipient levels of conscious and nascent causality, distinctions of self and other are blurred. At this level, minuscule events can have larger consequences that we can call free choice. The motivational process reaches up into higher levels of consciousness that promote faculties of personal identity of what we call free will. And reflective consciousness vastly increases what can be brought to bear as reasons for action. For example, personal identity, reasoning processes, powers of abstraction and discrimination. And consciousness increases the scope of what I can affirm or deny as my own thoughts. But does personal identity have sufficient material content to provide reasons for action? Not at the level of pure self-consciousness, yet pure self-consciousness is an illusion. Consciousness needs content, and personal identity provides consciousness with the content to make events my own. And if preceding events are my own, I have free will or self-will. We began this inquiry with the idea that it's psychologically impossible to believe that our actions are determined. That led to the consideration of consciousness and personal identity as key features in explaining free will. That is, consciousness and reflective consciousness correlate with the experience of free will. This isn't a conclusive argument for free will, even as self-will, but it gives us something more than the standard concepts that need explaining, and that something is difficult to explain on a deterministic account. So I conclude with a compatibilist position that we are both subject to both reason for action and free will as self-will. I gave three arguments for this view. 1. Phenomenologically, the appearance and belief in free will is crucial to substantive free will. 2. Reflective consciousness correlates with something that we can legitimately call free will. And 3. Our identification with our deepest reasons for action produces free will as self-will. So let me have your comments and criticisms at the meeting or on websites like Zoom or meetup.com. The kind of response I'm looking for is whether I have contributed to the question of free will, or what are the mistakes that I have made in this presentation that undermine it.